It began, at least for most people, as a punchline. News outlets joked about it. Late-night hosts mocked it. Commentators dismissed it as another headline designed to entertain rather than inform. But beneath all the laughter lurked a simple question that refused to go away. Why would the United States want to buy Greenland? On the surface, it made no sense. Greenland is a remote island covered in ice, sparsely populated, culturally distinct, and historically tied to Denmark. It is not a place the average American thinks about, or dreams about, or even bothers to notice on a map. And yet, there it was. An American president asking if a price could be attached to the largest island on Earth. The jokes obscured something deeper. Because while the spectacle seemed absurd, the motive behind it was not. It was, in fact, one of the most strategically rational proposals any modern U.S. administration had floated in decades. The laughter only showed how little the world understood Greenland. Greenland is not just ice. It is not just wilderness. It is not just a forgotten colonial remnant dangling off the northern edge of a world map. Greenland is leverage. Greenland is access. Greenland is control. And in an era defined by great power competition, control is everything. To understand the logic behind the attempted purchase, one must first accept a geopolitical reality that most of the public has never been taught. The Arctic is becoming the new Middle East, not because it resembles it culturally or religiously or historically, but because it contains the ingredients that define global power: energy, choke points, minerals, and strategic positioning. The resources of tomorrow are not merely flowing beneath deserts. They are locked beneath ice. Greenland sits at the center of that shift. It controls entry into the Arctic Ocean. It anchors North America to the top of the world. It holds some of the largest deposits of rare earth minerals known to exist outside of China. It guards the air routes between continents and the missile trajectories between superpowers. And as the ice melts, revealing what was once unreachable, Greenland's relevance is increasing, not in centuries, but in decades. The modern world laughed at the purchase proposal because the modern world assumed the map was static. But powerful nations know maps are not static. Maps are living things. They can be reshaped. They can be redrawn. And when redrawing is too expensive or too bloody, they can be bought. The United States has purchased strategic territory before. Alaska was mocked when it was purchased from Russia. It was called a frozen wasteland, a foolish expenditure. Today, that frozen wasteland is one of the most strategically critical pieces of North American territory. It controls the northern Pacific. It produced oil. It anchored the United States into the Arctic theater. History repeats itself, first as mockery, then as inevitability. To understand why Greenland matters now, one must understand how Greenland mattered before. Because Greenland is not a new prize in the minds of strategists. It is not a sudden discovery. It is a long-simmering objective, one that began long before the public noticed, long before the Internet age, long before the Arctic became a subject of diplomatic conferences and naval strategy tables. It began with war. The first strategic awakening. During the Second World War, Denmark fell to Nazi Germany. With its homeland occupied, Denmark could not defend Greenland. The island, remote, cold, and largely unknown to the global public, became a potential foothold for German weather stations, German reconnaissance, or even German bases. For the Allies, that risk was intolerable. If the Axis gained access to the Arctic approaches, it could threaten North American shipping routes or interfere with meteorological data crucial for planning naval and air campaigns. Weather may seem trivial to the civilian mind, but in war, weather decides battles. It determines when fleets can sail and when they must shelter. It decides when aircraft can cross oceans and when they must stand down. Before satellites, the only way to predict weather over Europe was to observe it over the Arctic first. Control Greenland's weather stations, and you shape Europe's skies. Recognizing this, the United States quietly assumed responsibility for Greenland's defense, an arrangement accepted by Denmark in exile. American forces established bases on the island, constructed airstrips, and monitored the icy coastline. Greenland entered a new category: territory too valuable to ignore. When the war ended, the United States did not simply pack up and go home. It offered to buy the island from Denmark. Money was placed on the table. Negotiations flickered, and Denmark refused. The episode was soon forgotten by the public. But intelligence agencies, militaries, and foreign ministries did not forget. For them, a new question emerged. What would the next war make of Greenland? They did not have to wait long. The Arctic meets the Cold War. When the period of post-war uncertainty hardened into the Cold War, Greenland's geography revealed its value again. To understand why, one must leave the realm of tourism brochures and think instead like a missile. The shortest flight path between North America and the Soviet Union was not across the Atlantic or the Pacific. It was across the Arctic. The top of the globe was not empty space. It was a highway for bombers and ballistic trajectories. Superpowers understood this instantly. If you wanted to know when the other side launched, if you wanted to intercept, if you wanted early warning, you needed eyes, ears, and radar in the Arctic. And so Greenland gained its second strategic function, the role of sentinel. The United States constructed Thule Air Base in the far north of the island, a project of immense logistical and political complexity. The base became a node in the American early warning network, a place where radar tracked the skies for intrusions, where aircraft refueled, where surveillance became routine. Thule was not a normal base, it was a cornerstone of nuclear strategy. To protect the U.S. mainland from the unthinkable, Greenland became indispensable. This was not abstract theory. Crises confirmed it. When a B-52 bomber carrying nuclear weapons crashed near Thule in the late 1960s, the secrecy and urgency surrounding the cleanup underscored how central the base was to American security. Topsoil was scraped, snow was removed, debris was classified, nuclear weapons were recovered. The incident was not merely an accident. It was evidence of how deeply the Cold War had embedded itself into the Arctic. And as is always the case in geopolitics, once a location becomes important, it rarely stops being important. The Cold War made Greenland visible, but that was only the second phase of its strategic life. A third phase was waiting, quiet at first, then explosive. The submerged wealth of ice. Geopolitics follows resources. Nations can pretend their motives are moral or ideological, but the real contest is always over things that build power: energy, minerals, transportation routes, and industrial capacity. Until recently, Greenland was insulated from this logic for one simple reason: it was sealed under ice. To extract wealth from beneath its surface would require technology that did not exist, transportation infrastructure that could not be justified, and financial incentives that could not be defended. But climate does not negotiate, and climate does not care about political convenience. As Arctic temperatures rose, ice receded, glaciers thinned, land emerged, and with it emerged the oldest geopolitical catalyst in human civilization: opportunity. Beneath Greenland lie vast deposits of rare earth elements, the minerals that make modern technology function. Every smartphone, every electric vehicle, every drone, every guided missile, every radar system, every battery, every wind turbine requires them. They are not glamorous, they are not well understood by the public, but they are the quiet foundation of the digital age. Today, one nation dominates global rare earth production: China. Greenland represents one of the few places on Earth where that monopoly can be challenged. And so the island entered a new contest, not between old colonial powers, but between industrial giants. Mining companies arrived, exploratory surveys were commissioned, Chinese firms offered investment, American strategic planners issued warnings, environmentalists raised alarms, indigenous communities debated independence versus extraction. This was no longer a Cold War story, it was a resource war story. And resource wars are not fought with missiles first. They are fought with contracts, loans, infrastructure, markets, and ownership stakes. By the time the first battleships arrive, the war has usually already been decided. The fourth phase, the lanes of the future. But minerals are only half the equation. The second half is logistics. As the Arctic melts, a new set of shipping lanes is opening, lanes that bypass the traditional choke points of global trade. The Suez Canal, the Panama Canal, and the Straits of Malacca are the arteries of the modern economy. Whoever controls them controls commerce. Whoever bypasses them rewrites commerce. For centuries, nature prevented Arctic bypass. Ice was a wall, but walls crack. And when walls crack, geopolitics accelerates. Russia already uses portions of the Northern Sea route along its coastline. China brands itself a near-Arctic power, despite having no Arctic coastline at all. Europe studies new logistics corridors. The United States looks northward with fresh anxiety, because if the Arctic becomes a viable trade route, control of the gateways becomes as important as control of the canals once was. Greenland sits beside those future lanes. The island is not merely a landmass, it is a checkpoint. It is a position from which to monitor, influence, and, if necessary, deny passage. In maritime strategy, these functions define power. With rare earths beneath its ground and shipping lanes above its waters, Greenland's value transformed again. In earlier centuries, powers fought over deserts because deserts held oil. In the 21st century, they turn north because the north holds the materials of electrification and the routes of global trade. The Arctic is not the new Middle East because it looks similar. It is the new Middle East because it matters similarly. Returning to the laughter. And so the question returns, why did the world laugh? Why did the attempt to purchase Greenland become a joke? Because the modern world lacks geopolitical memory. It imagines the map as a finished product rather than a negotiable instrument. It believes borders are natural outcomes rather than temporary arrangements. It assumes territorial transactions are relics of the 19th century rather than tools of statecraft still used in the 21st. The truth is that land purchases never stopped. They only became quieter. China buys ports in Europe. Gulf states buy farmland in Africa. Corporations buy water rights from governments. Nations lease naval facilities for decades at a time. Influence replaces ownership when ownership is inconvenient. Modern empires do not always plant flags. Sometimes they plant contracts. Seen through that lens, the attempted purchase of Greenland was not eccentric. It was strategic. The timing was no accident. The resources were known. The Arctic climate projections were public. The geopolitics were shifting. And the United States understood that if it did not move, others would. The laugh, therefore, belonged not to the proposal, but to the audience. The Cold War and the ice base. The world that emerged after the Second World War was not a world at peace. It was a world rearranged. Alliances were redrawn, empires dissolved, weapons modernized, and former partners became rivals. The Soviet Union and the United States did not merely compete for territory. They competed for ideology, for legitimacy, for influence, and above all, for time. The question that dominated strategic thinking from Washington to Moscow was not, who controls Europe? But who strikes first? The answer to that question ran through the Arctic. The public imagined nuclear war in cinematic terms. Mushroom clouds rising over cities, submarines firing missiles from beneath the waves, or aircraft streaking across continents. But military planners saw something more specific and more technical: trajectories, distances, early warning windows, and interception arcs. The shortest route between the U.S. mainland and the Soviet mainland was not around the world. It was over the pole, and that fact made Greenland central. The Arctic stopped being a frontier. It became a corridor. Thule, the Sentinel outpost. To exploit that corridor, the United States built the most consequential piece of Cold War infrastructure on Greenland, Thule Air Base. Thule was not a normal base. It was not designed for comfort, nor for local engagement, nor for economic development. It was designed for purity of function. Its function was to watch. Its function was to warn. Its function was to survive the first 5 minutes of nuclear war long enough to alert the continental United States. The base was carved into permafrost and Arctic rock. Runways were extended for bombers and refueling aircraft. Radar domes sprouted like white blisters across the landscape. Tracking stations hummed through the night, plotting the motions of objects that the public did not know existed. Missiles, satellites, prototypes, test flights. For the United States, Thule became a critical node in the early warning network known as BMEWS, the Ballistic Missile Early Warning System. BMEWS was the difference between civilization and annihilation measured in minutes. If a launch was detected too late, response would be impossible. If detected early enough, the U.S. could retaliate, and retaliation was the basis of deterrence. Without deterrence, the nuclear age collapses. Greenland, therefore, was no longer about sealing off Europe's weather. It was about forecasting civilization's survival. Thule was positioned where it was for a reason. It had line-of-sight advantage. It could monitor polar flight paths. It could track Soviet bombers and, later, Soviet missiles arching over the pole. It became part of a lattice of sensors stretching from Alaska to the United Kingdom. A tripwire stretched across the top of the world. If the tripwire broke, Washington would know. The relocation of a people. But the construction of Thule came with a cost that rarely appears in grand strategy textbooks. The local Inuit population was relocated, not exterminated, not erased, but moved, pushed farther north, away from ancestral hunting grounds and into harsher terrain. The Danish government justified the relocation as necessary for national interests. The United States justified it as necessary for security. The Inuit had no say in either justification. To geopoliticians, the relocation was a footnote. To the Inuit, it was an upheaval. The pattern was not new. Strategic land is rarely empty. It is emptied. Greenland was never conquered by force, but it was reorganized by necessity. The nuclear incident. Thule's importance was confirmed not by speeches, but by accidents. In January of 1968, a B-52 bomber carrying 4 nuclear weapons crashed near the base while performing an airborne alert mission. The public was told only fragments. The rest was classified. The topsoil harvested for cleanup was packed into containers and shipped to the United States. Radiation surveys were conducted. Diplomatic cables flew between Copenhagen and Washington. The crash was not evidence that Thule was mismanaged. It was evidence that Thule was vital. Nuclear weapons only orbit places that matter. The accident also revealed something else. Denmark had officially declared itself nuclear-free, but Thule was not technically Denmark. It was Greenland, administered by Denmark, used by the United States, and integrated into NATO. The neutrality policy bent around strategic necessity. In geopolitics, principles survive until they collide with geography. Geography usually wins. The U.S. purchase attempt, Greenland's strategic awakening during WLF2, had already prompted the United States to offer to buy the island from Denmark once before. The offer was serious. Money was real. Washington was prepared to write a check. Denmark refused. The refusal was not purely sentimental. Denmark understood that sovereignty is more valuable than cash when sovereignty can be leveraged. If a nation has something a superpower wants, it should not sell it. It should negotiate it, lease it, or withhold it. A buyer pays once, a rival pays forever. Denmark chose rent over sale. Denmark's Arctic dilemma. Denmark had no illusions about its size. It had no illusions about its military power. It did not aspire to be a great power in the classic sense. But Denmark possessed something more subtle: optionality. Great powers need things. Small powers own things. The tension between needing and owning creates bargaining space. Greenland was Denmark's leverage, not against the world, but against irrelevance. It allowed Denmark to participate in NATO with more weight than its population would justify. It allowed Denmark to shape Arctic policy at tables it would otherwise not be invited to. It allowed Denmark to remain strategically relevant without building aircraft carriers or ballistic missile submarines. In international politics, there are 2 paths to influence: power and assets. Denmark chose assets. As the Cold War deepened, Greenland was not merely a liability to defend, it was an asset to negotiate. The Arctic security architecture. The Cold War produced institutions. NATO was the most famous, NORAD was the most specialized, and the Arctic governance frameworks were the most understated. NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, integrated Canadian and American defense systems into a shared continental shield. It did not include Denmark. It did not include Europe. It included the nations that would burn first if missiles flew south. The Arctic was not a European theater. It was a hemispheric one. NATO absorbed Greenland into its planning indirectly. It treated the island as an extension of the North Atlantic, not as a separate colonial remnant. The Soviet Union understood this. Soviet submarines patrolled beneath the ice. Soviet bombers tested response times. Soviet satellites photographed every runway, tower, and dome. The Arctic was quiet to civilians. It was loud to generals. The public imagined Cold War strategy as a chessboard focused on Berlin. But the real game board was circular. The pieces moved around the rim of the world, not across its center. Greenland and the nuclear clock. By the 1970s, the technology of destruction improved. Intercontinental ballistic missiles replaced bombers as the primary delivery system for nuclear warheads. Submarines added second strike capability. Satellites added reconnaissance. One might assume that this rendered Greenland obsolete. Why use an airbase when submarines hide beneath oceans? But Greenland's value did not decline. It shifted. With missiles, the early warning window shrank from hours to minutes. The Arctic became the only place where sensors could detect launches quickly enough to enable response. Without detection, deterrence collapses. Without deterrence, first strikes become rational. Greenland kept the clock running. The end of the Cold War was not the end of Greenland. When the Soviet Union collapsed, analysts predicted peace. The nuclear stockpiles remained, but the ideological contest evaporated. Budgets shrank. Bases were downsized. Threat assessments turned inward. To some, Greenland became a relic, a Cold War fossil preserved in ice. They were wrong on 2 counts. First, geography does not retire when ideologies do. Second, resources do not become irrelevant because diplomacy is polite. Even in the 1990s, geologists were already surveying Greenland's rare earth potential. Chinese investors were already exploring mining concessions. Shipping analysts were already modeling the viability of trans-Arctic lanes. The public did not see this because the public sees geopolitics only when it explodes. Real geopolitics happens before explosions. The rise of Greenlandic autonomy. While global powers shifted their gaze, Greenland itself evolved. Greenland was not merely a resource, it was a society. For centuries, its political status had been colonial. Later, it became provincial. But after the Cold War, Greenland began a gradual march toward autonomy. Home rule was granted. Self-government expanded. Referendums were held. Debates erupted over independence. Not theoretical independence, but operational independence. Independence, in Greenlandic terms, does not simply mean sovereignty. It means economic viability. No state wants to trade one dependency for another. To govern oneself requires funding oneself, and funding oneself requires income. Income, for Greenland, lies beneath the ice. Rare earth mining, uranium extraction, offshore oil, and Arctic shipping lanes are not merely commercial ventures. They are potential pillars of statehood. This is where geopolitics returns to the surface. Because every resource Greenland could use to gain independence is a resource other nations need to maintain power. China needs rare earths for industry. The United States needs rare earths for defense. Europe needs rare earths for energy transition. And no one wants the others to secure exclusive supply. Greenland's path to independence runs through a minefield of superpower interests. Denmark understands this. It understands that if Greenland becomes independent too quickly, it may not become independent at all. It may transit from Danish dependency to Chinese dependency or American dependency. Colonialism does not always wear a uniform. Sometimes it wears a loan agreement. China enters the ice. In the early 21st century, China did something audacious. It declared itself a near-Arctic state. The term had no legal meaning. It had no geographic meaning. It existed for one reason only, to make Arctic participation sound natural. China backed the declaration with capital. Chinese mining companies pursued Greenlandic concessions. Chinese state-backed firms offered infrastructure financing. Chinese diplomats made visits once reserved for NATO officials. For Beijing, the logic was simple. China controls rare earth refining. Greenland controls rare earth deposits. If China could secure both, it could extend its monopoly into the next century. For Washington, that was unacceptable. The United States did not need to mine Greenland. It only needed to deny China the ability to mine Greenland. Blocking is cheaper than owning. When a Chinese company attempted to acquire an abandoned naval base in Greenland for infrastructure development, Denmark, under quiet U.S. pressure, blocked the bid. It did so not because the base itself mattered, but because the precedent mattered. Real estate is not real estate when it controls maritime access. NATO reawakens to the Arctic. By the 2010s, NATO began reactivating interest in the Arctic, partly because of Russia's renewed military activity, partly because of China's economic encroachment, and partly because the ice was melting faster than projections had forecast. Naval exercises were held at higher latitudes. Satellite coverage expanded. Arctic command structures were reviewed, and Greenland moved up briefing documents from footnote to bullet point. This is why the laughter surrounding a U.S. attempt to purchase Greenland was so misplaced. Only civilians laughed. Governments did not laugh. Intelligence agencies did not laugh. Military planners did not laugh. Denmark definitely did not laugh. They understood what the public did not. The Arctic was becoming crowded. During the Cold War, the Arctic was a two-player game. Now it is multiplayer. Russia wants northern sea routes. China wants minerals. The United States wants denial. Europe wants climate stability. Denmark wants autonomy without abandonment. Greenland wants independence without subjugation. Everyone wants something. No one wants to give something. This is how geopolitical flashpoints form. Greenland is not a flashpoint yet, but the ingredients are assembling, and the ice continues to melt. The ice crown in the 21st century. The world has changed, but Greenland has not. Ice melts, seas rise, satellites orbit overhead, but the strategic value of the island has only grown. Today, Greenland sits at the crossroads of history and the future, where global powers converge on its frozen expanse, each with a different plan, but all aware of the same undeniable truth. Whoever controls Greenland wields influence over the Arctic, and, increasingly, over the fate of global trade, resources, and security. It was in this context that the notion of purchasing Greenland reappeared, decades after the island had first entered the imagination of American policymakers. To most citizens, it sounded absurd. Greenland, after all, is covered in ice, sparsely populated, and historically tied to Denmark. The idea of buying it seemed like a joke or a PR stunt, but for those who study strategy, it was far from funny. The proposal reflected decades of calculation, foresight, and the brutal arithmetic of power. Former U.S. President Donald Trump raised the issue not once, but repeatedly. It was not a passing whim, a casual comment, or a moment of improvisation. From a strategic standpoint, acquiring Greenland would achieve several objectives. It would consolidate U.S. presence in the Arctic, secure rare earth minerals and other critical resources, deny rivals, particularly China and Russia, the chance to gain influence and control future shipping lanes as the ice retreats. The rationale was simple: control the high ground, and you control the game. For centuries, Greenland had been a pawn. In the 20th century, it was a pawn in global wars. During U.S., its location mattered for weather observation and military positioning. During the Cold War, it was a sentinel for nuclear early warning systems. Now, in the 21st century, it was a pawn again, but this time in a subtler, more complex contest, where satellites, investments, mining concessions, and diplomatic influence were the weapons of choice. Trump's interest in Greenland brought the island into headlines once more. But beneath the spectacle lay a much larger reality. Greenland's resources are strategic, and its geography is indispensable. Rare earth minerals, vital for modern technology and defense, are concentrated beneath its ice. Oil and gas exploration, though controversial, remain potentially lucrative, and the Arctic shipping lanes opening as ice retreats could redefine global commerce. Whoever controls Greenland can observe, influence, and, if necessary, restrict these flows. To understand the implications of a potential acquisition, one must examine the geopolitical chessboard. China has declared itself a near-Arctic state, investing in Greenlandic infrastructure and exploring mining opportunities. Russia monitors every shipping route and airspace over the Arctic, projecting military power when necessary. European nations are interested in climate research and resource access. And the United States, keen to maintain its Northern Hemisphere dominance, views Greenland as a linchpin of Arctic strategy. Trump's proposals to purchase Greenland reflected not ignorance, but an acute understanding of these dynamics. Unlike previous attempts, this initiative was highly publicized, and the reactions varied widely. Denmark, unsurprisingly, rejected the notion outright, affirming its sovereignty and emphasizing that Greenland is not for sale. But the very fact that such a proposal was considered publicly underscores the enduring strategic calculus. When an asset is critical enough, extraordinary measures are contemplated. Acquiring Greenland would not have been simple. It would require diplomatic maneuvering, financial incentives, and political negotiation, not just with Denmark, but with Greenland itself, whose government enjoys significant autonomy and whose population is increasingly vocal about independence. This adds a layer of complexity rarely encountered in international transactions. Sovereignty cannot be purchased with money alone. Legitimacy and consent are equally crucial. Even a superpower cannot ignore local stakeholders if it seeks lasting influence. Meanwhile, Greenland continues to assert its autonomy. Its government has been cautious, balancing the desire for independence with the practical reality that foreign investment, whether from the United States, China, or other nations, provides economic lifelines. The local population is aware that their choices will determine not only the island's economy, but also its geopolitical future. Independence, or even partial self-rule, cannot be achieved without navigating the competing ambitions of great powers. The strategic calculus is multidimensional. Greenland offers mineral wealth that can underpin technological independence. It provides access to shipping lanes that could shorten trade routes and reduce dependency on traditional canals. Its geography allows for military observation, early warning, and potential denial capabilities. And politically, it serves as leverage for both Denmark and Greenland, giving them influence over the Arctic discourse that far exceeds their population size. Trump's interest brought these issues into sharp focus for the global public. Headlines emphasized the spectacle of a superpower attempting to buy a sparsely populated island. Analysts, however, looked deeper. They saw the intersection of resources, security, and international influence. They recognized that Greenland's ice was melting not only because of climate change, but also because of opportunity. The thaw revealed not just rivers and fjords, but pipelines of power, pipelines of minerals, pipelines of influence. The U.S. effort to acquire Greenland, therefore, was not an anomaly. It was the logical continuation of a centuries-old pattern. Every great power that has gazed northward has confronted the same truths. During U.S., Greenland mattered for weather and bases. During the Cold War, it mattered for radar and deterrence. In the present, it matters for resources, shipping, and influence. Geography has long memories. Strategic relevance does not fade, it evolves. And yet, the story is not merely one of great power ambition. Greenland itself is an actor. Its leaders negotiate, assert autonomy, and manage foreign investment. Its people vote, express opinion, and participate in shaping the island's future. This interaction between local agency and global strategy is what makes Greenland exceptional. It is not simply territory to be acquired. It is a dynamic stage upon which superpowers project influence. The Trump episode illustrates another principle of geopolitics. Visibility matters. A public proposal may seem crude, but it signals intent, tests reactions, and influences behavior. Allies take notice. Rivals take note. The domestic audience is informed. Even failed initiatives leave consequences. In this sense, the Greenland proposal was a strategic message, a reminder that the Arctic remains central to future conflicts and competitions. Finally, Greenland's role in the 21st century is a reminder that strategy often transcends time. The same geographic advantages that made it vital for meteorological stations in the 1940s, early warning systems in the 1960s, and mineral exploration in the 2000s now define its place in the emerging multipolar world. Ice may recede, politics may shift, presidents may change, but the island's significance endures, because geography and resources rarely relinquish their influence. The lesson is clear. Maps are not static, and no territory is ever irrelevant. Greenland's story, from colonial outpost to Cold War sentinel, from resource frontier to geopolitical pivot, is a living demonstration of how geography, power, and ambition intersect. The attempt to purchase it, whether by Trump or any future leader, is merely the latest chapter in a story that began long before the public noticed and will continue long after the headlines fade. And so, as the Arctic ice melts and new shipping routes emerge, Greenland sits quietly in the northern expanse, an island that is not frozen in time, but rather frozen in strategy. Its past, present, and future are inseparable from the calculations of those who seek influence over the Arctic, the resources beneath it, and the global power it represents. To understand Greenland is to understand a fundamental truth of geopolitics. Geography endures, ambition never sleeps, and power always seeks the high ground.